Have you ever wondered if the true strength of a man is measured by the height of his throne, or by the staggering weight of the stones he is willing to carry when his entire world has been leveled by malice? Today we bring you a story of fierce resilience and a devotion so profound it will leave you in awe. In this heart-wrenching chapter, we witness CEO Jame, a man whose hands once signed billion-dollar contracts, now trading his dignity for the grueling dust of a construction site. This is not just a story of survival, it is a sacred and noble testament to a love that refuses to be buried under the debris of betrayal. Stay with us as we witness a mother's heart being shattered into 1,000 pieces while watching her son fall from the heights of glory into the mud of reality. The morning sun hung low and pale over the construction site, casting long, fragile shadows across the piles of broken bricks and gray cement dust that seemed to choke the very air. James stood in the center of this chaotic wasteland, his body completely stripped of its former aristocratic armor. Gone were the tailored suits, the polished boardroom tables, and the sterile white walls that once drained the warmth from his soul. He now wore only a dirty, torn gray tank top, a rag of a garment that clung desperately to his sweat-drenched skin, revealing the raw, muscular grit of a man driven by nothing but the instinct to protect. The skin of his shoulders, once accustomed to the softest silk, was now bruised and raw, yet he did not flinch. Every breath he took was a bitter battle against the suffocating dust, his muscles shaking with intense effort as he hoisted a massive, heavy sack of cement. This was his silent, agonizing, and soul-wrenching vow to a world that wanted him to starve, a tangible action that no amount of wealth could ever replace. Beside him, Diep moved like a ghost of her former self, yet her spirit remained an unbreakable anchor. She was the Huyen of purity and patience, her thin and pale frame reaching out with trembling hands to support the bottom of James' heavy load. She did not care about the mud that stained her worn clothes or the exhaustion that threatened to pull her to the earth. Her eyes were fixed only on Jame, filled with heartbreaking tears that spoke of a devotion more sacred and noble than any royal treasure. Every time their eyes met amidst the roar of machinery and the stench of diesel, a touching and meaningful silence settled between them. A communion of souls that proved Mr. Huyen could take their home, but he could never touch the temple they had built within their hearts. They were no longer a CEO and a rural girl. They were two survivors forging a covenant in the fire of shared suffering. Hidden behind a rotting wall of dried leaves and weathered wood, a solitary figure watched this scene with a heart that was being systematically torn apart. Mrs. Huyen, the mother who had raised Jame in unimaginable luxury, stood trembling in the shadows. She had come to this impoverished corner of the world in secret, carrying a small bundle of hope, only to be met with a sight that shattered her last remaining defenses. Her elegant hand was pressed firmly over her mouth, her fingers digging into her skin to stifle the desperate, agonizing sobs that threatened to betray her presence. She looked at Jame, her precious son, the boy whose future was once written in the stars, now reduced to a puffin in the mud, his skin grimy and his once clear eyes now blurred by the stinging salt of sweat. Each time Jame gritted his teeth to lift another sack, Mrs. Huyen felt the weight of his struggle as if it were a physical blow to her own soul. She looked at Diep, the girl her husband, Mr. Huyen, had treated like a shadow to be erased, and saw the very strength that was keeping her son alive. It was a soul-wrenching realization for a mother to see that the life she had once planned for her son was a sterile, hollow dream, while this poverty-stricken wasteland held a love that was breathtakingly real. The indifference of the construction site, with its cold machines and heartless foremen, was a reflection of the tyranny Mr. Huyen had imposed upon his own flesh and blood. Puri in Mrs. Huyen leaned against the decaying Vakhilamuk, her eyes nole as she whispered a silent prayer for their protection. She was a witness to a tragedy of epic proportions, Yet beneath the debris of their lives, she could feel a new determination being born, a sacred certainty that the man Jame had become in the mud was far more sacred and noble than the CEO he had been in the Palace of Glass. The relentless roar of the cement mixers and the harsh shouting of the foreman faded into a dull hum as Mrs. Huyen finally stepped out from behind the decaying leaf wall. Her presence was like a fragile piece of silk dropped into a pit of thorns. She moved toward Jame and Diep with trembling steps, her elegant shawl fluttering in the dust-laden wind. When Jame finally noticed her, he froze. A massive sack of cement still braced against his raw, aching shoulder. In that breathtaking and stunned moment, time seemed to stop. The once mighty CEO, now a man of the earth with mud caked under his fingernails and sweat burning his eyes, looked at his mother not with shame, but with a fierce, untouchable pride. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken tragedies of their family's collapse. Mrs. Huyen reached out her hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to touch the dirty, torn fabric of James' tank top. Her voice was a broken whisper, choked with agonizing and soul-wrenching sorrow. She pleaded with him to let her help, to take the secret stash of gold and medicine she had brought, and to find a way to escape this impoverished corner before his spirit was completely crushed by Mr. Huyen's cruelty. She looked at Diep, who was standing steadfastly by James' side, and for the first time, she saw not a social outcast, but the divine and profound anchor that was keeping her son's soul intact. The tears flowed freely now, washing paths through the dust on her own face, as she begged Jame to reconsider the life of comfort he had left behind in the sterile white walls of their mansion. But Jame only straightened his back, the heavy sack shifting on his shoulder like a mountain of resolve. His voice, hoarse from the dust and exhaustion, vibrated with a sacred and noble power that echoed through the skeletal steel beams of the construction site. He looked his mother directly in the eyes and made his vow, a promise etched in sweat and sacrifice. He declared that he would never return to a palace of glass if it meant living as a puppet of a tyrant. He swore that every drop of sweat he shed in this mud was a betrothal gift to Diep, and every blister on his hands was a brick in the foundation of a kingdom where love was the only law. He told his mother that he had found more honor in this dirty gray tank top than he ever had in a tailored suit, because for the first time, he was building a life with his own bare hands for the woman who truly mattered. As the golden hour descended, casting a fierce, fiery glow over the steel and debris, a profound peace settled over the trio. Mrs. Huyen realized that her son had not fallen. He had ascended to a height of character that his father could never understand. She placed the medicine and the warm food into Diep's hands, no longer as a superior, but as a mother acknowledging a daughter. The touching and meaningful exchange of glances between the two women marked a new covenant. Jame took a deep breath, the scent of wet cement and exhaustion filling his lungs, and turned back to his work. He knew the path ahead was treacherous, but as long as he had Diep by his side and his mother's silent blessing, poverty was no longer a curse. It was the crucible where an eternal legacy was being forged. And so, dear viewers, we learn that the true measure of a man is not found in the luxury he enjoys, but in the suffering he endures for the sake of love. When a man is willing to plunge his hands into the mud to shield his beloved from the storm, he becomes more than a CEO. He becomes a legend. Jame and Diep have proven that a love built on profound sacrifice can withstand the heaviest blows from any ghost of the past. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, please subscribe and share this story. Join us next time as we witness the unstoppable rise of two souls who refuse to be broken.
Từ đỉnh cao quyền lực, Jame rơi xuống công trường bụi bặm, chấp nhận lao động nặng nhọc để bảo vệ tình yêu đối Diep sau khi bị gia đình vây lưng. Giữa nắng gắt và xi măng, anh dùng đôi tay từng ký hợp đồng tỷ đô để vác từng bao nặng, coi đó là lời thề xây dựng tương lai bằng chính sức mình. Diep dù yếu ớt vẫn kề vai sát cánh, trở thành điểm tựa tinh thần giúp anh đứng vững. Chứng kiến cảnh ấy, bà Huyền đau đớn nhận ra con trai không sa ngã mà đang trưởng thành từ nghịch cảnh. Khi bà bí mật mang thuốc và thức ăn đến, Jame từ chối quay lại cuộc sống cũ, chọn con đường tự do và tình yêu. Cuối cùng, sự chấp nhận của bà Huyền đã mở ra hy vọng mới cho gia đình nhỏ.